together. Sue.
I'm very sorry, Libby. It kicked itself off.
Okay.
You,
There were.
would you be willing to start that again?
The whole thing?
Your introduction, just your introduction. Yeah.
Okay, Bobby, for
Sorry.
you. Well, we are very pleased to welcome our guest today, Sue Durrant, a pioneer in women's athletics at WSU. She led WSU volleyball as coach from 1971 to 72 and 1973 to 1982, and women's volleyball for 12 seasons. She was inducted into the Cougar Hall of Fame, the Pullman Walk of Fame, and the WSU Hall of Fame. And most importantly for our presentation today, she was a plaintiff in the Blair versus WSU case, which was all about Title IX on our campus. And the lawsuit was brought after Congress passed Title IX of the Education Act amendments, which prohibited discrimination, particularly based on sex, in any program or entity that receives federal funding. So that case, Blair versus WSU, changed the face of women's athletics forever. And Sue is a friend of mine, and I asked her if she would please be with us to share some of her reflections. I asked her, don't worry about a formal presentation. We'll have lots of questions. Just tell us what you remember, what it was like, maybe before Blair, how things changed because of Blair, what it was like to sue your own university, things like that. So I think it'll be very interesting. So Sue, with no further delay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Libby, and welcome to all of you who decided you'd like to have your reflections on Title IX as well. This is mainly just reflections. I did not prepare a formal presentation because I knew that just ties me down too much. But I'd ask in starting as far as for you to reflect on where you were in 1972. And unless you're in the 60-year-old and up age group, you probably were not immediately impacted by what that meant. I was already at WSU, and already we were trying to improve opportunities for women to participate in sports at the athletic level. And we had been working throughout the Northwest to set up a regional organization to help govern that, because more and more girls were coming to college with an interest in doing that. And so we had sports involved in competition, or what we would call athletic competition, even before I came to WSU. Some of the people, it was handled primarily by women's physical education departments, and the professional organization which governed that, and particularly the Northwest region of that, were very active in setting up parameters and constitutions and bylaws to start governing the competitions throughout the Northwest in all sports that we offered. And we included everybody, 2-year colleges as well as 4-year colleges. Later, the 2-year colleges had to pull out because their governing organization would not let them belong. And in the early 70s, about the same time as Title IX, we had the national organization for women called the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women start. I mean, it had been a commission before that, but they officially became organized. I think it was in 1972 as well. And we were among the founding members in that national organization. Title IX was very interesting for all of us because we thought it would be the impetus for change. Well, the impetus doesn't happen just by magic. You have to start doing various kinds of things in order to get it to happen. And of course, our programs in those days were mainly add-ons to our teaching loads. And then gradually we were able to obtain some partial relief to our teaching load by coaching sports or being advisor to various organizations. I was involved with Fish Fans for a number of years, and some of you may remember Fish Fans because we did big water shows on Mother's Weekend. That no longer happens, but it was interesting at those time periods. So we were doing our best to offer increased opportunities for women to be involved in sports. When I came, it seemed like I was surprised to see the sports that were offered. We already were playing among about 6 colleges in the Inland Empire. Besides WSU, there was University of Idaho, Eastern, Central, and I think Gonzaga and Whitworth were involved in that. And they were close enough you could travel there. Travel was always by not personal cars and not buses, but by the motor pool from the university. And so to do that, you had to get your student athletes, or a certain number of them, certified to drive as well. So that's how we traveled. We didn't travel the way they do now. And for the most part, I was the only coach with them with the teams that I went with. And, we did our best in terms of handling the meals and the other kinds of things on very minimal budgetary type things. So when Title IX passed, we thought, oh, okay, we'll just keep moving and seeing what we can do within the system to advance. And we thought the university would be willing to do this. Well, they only did it because they had to. All institutions with the passage of Title IX had to review their whole institution, not just athletics. Athletics you hear about more often, but it had to do with other opportunities available to men and women, or girls and boys if it were high schools. And so it involved, like at the university level, from the standpoint of, well, what were the dormitories like? Well, you knew which ones were men's dormitories because they would talk about recreational equipment and sports teams, and the women's were always, irons and ironing boards and cooking and things like that. So you could always tell. So those things all had to change as well. They had to look at all the majors and see if they were really open to men and women, which they weren't. If you were here during that time, there are very few vet students who were women, probably only one, maybe two engineers. You just didn't find them. And if they were on the faculty, they certainly weren't in positions of power at all in terms of the administrative channels. The main areas where you found more women were, of course, in the College of Education. Of course, that's where women's physical education was housed. And but you didn't find the administrators being women. So there were a lot of things that were involved with Title IX, including review of faculty salaries and so on and so forth. So it involved thorough things throughout the institution, as well as what was happening in athletic programs. And at that particular time period, you had to come up with what might be some ways to move us forward in all those areas, within a time frame and so on and so forth. Well, we kept wondering why things didn't change once we were told the report had been submitted. I worked on several committees. Besides the athletic one, I worked on publications to make sure that the language was neutral, and on clubs and sports that were like mortarboard and things like that. They became open to both men and women. All organizations had to not be gender specific. So it was quite a process involved in doing that review. Well, we never could find out, but we heard that somehow the athletic part of that got deep six someplace and was not submitted for whatever the reasons the university decided. And of course, by this time, this moves us into sort of the mid to upper 70s. And the students that were coming in to Washington State University and probably into other universities were coming out of high schools who had started making changes. Of course, they had parental pressure at the high school level. You didn't find that parental pressure at universities. The parents just aren't where the universities are, and they don't see the day-to-day things that are happening. So they were coming in and wondering, why was the university so backward? They had more opportunities in the high school level. So they were pushing a lot. At that particular time at WSU was also kind of the fledgling time of the Women's Center, and also the women's programs, which is women's studies programs, yes. And so women were working in different areas to try and move the university forward as far as opportunities for women. And there was a lot of resistance. And so, as you can imagine, so we worked through the system as best we could. Finally, we thought we're going to have to do more. So coaches were not covered under Title IX at that time period. They have been since, but they weren't covered. So we had to file a complaint with the EEOC, which is Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The athletes, unbeknown to us as coaches, filed a Title IX complaint with what was OCR at that time, Office for Civil Rights. And I remember I was over at a workshop at Montana State when the news hit there that the athletes had filed the Title IX complaint. And I thought, oh, good for them. You know, I can remember where I was at certain time periods when it came about. And you had to file these complaints anyway. But then they just seemed like they got shelved. The athletes actually filed another one. And there were certain named athletes on those complaints. Well, in one year, when we came back from, I think it was Christmas vacation, the students from Seattle, they had found a law firm who was willing to take on their case. And at that time it was called the Northwest Women's Law Center. It's now called Legal Voice. And they take cases which can impact a large number of people, not just the people that are immediately involved. And so we talked about it, and the coach, I mean, we were asked, did we want to join in? Because they were going forward anyway. And we decided that it was probably just better for all of us to put forth our efforts in one regard and not go different directions. So we joined into that lawsuit when it was first becoming evident that it was moving in that direction. And we had support from many women on campus. Some had their jobs sort of threatened as well, because, you know, they were involved in trying to house the lawyers when we got to that point, through all the discovery phases and everything else that was involved in doing the lawsuit. And so there were a lot of people said, you know, we support what you do, but we can't be visible doing it. It's just the pressures of the time and who had the power, just like it continues to be in many regards. So we just kept moving forward through the discovery phases. We had always kept good notes as far as evaluating programs and what was available to men and what was available to women. And we had sent reports to various committees. Of course, all those committees eventually report to the president's office. So there is no way around that until you get lawyers. And then all of a sudden, the university will start talking about things. And so it was interesting to see how that whole process works out. And actually, the university actually hired outside lawyers beyond just their own lawyers, which are represented. Sally Savage was there at that time. And so it was lawyers in town that actually handled the court case. But it was just kind of it's a time-consuming thing to do that, and then be able to get access to the various locker rooms. I mean, we were there at early morning hours, you know, so that they could have access to the men's locker rooms and other things like that, and see where things were logistically, and how, you know, women didn't have any locker rooms. So women all shared the locker room with the main women's locker room on campus, and that just see how much the inequities were going to be able to be utilized in the presentation of the court case. Other things that were involved at that time. So in the late 70s, we're busy doing all the discovery phase and the various kinds of things. And I don't understand all the legal things that are involved in doing that, but eventually the court date was set for early in 1982. And so that was the move at that particular time. And of course, besides just looking at facilities, and there were very little monies available for scholarships. Part of that was because in women's athletics initially under the AIAW, scholarships were not encouraged, because that's a big expense to be able to recruit and put money into that. And there just wasn't that kind of money or support at universities at that time. And there were a few that were being offered, and including here at WSU. People probably know that Jeannie Eggert-Helfer was the first to receive a women's athletic scholarship, and that was through the help of George Raveling. And I had always worked closely with George anyway, because he was the men's basketball coach and we got along very well. And he just took some funds or monies that came from the camp that he ran every summer on campus and set it aside to do that. It was just a partial scholarship. And then we were able to generate a minimum amount of money in other ways to help some others. But for the most part, women did not have access to scholarships. We tried to do some fundraising, but when we go out, the word that we were met with was, oh, you're just trying to do away with men's athletics. Well, we were trying to find the donors who would support women's athletics. We weren't going after the donors to men's athletic programs. So we were kind of stymied even by the fundraising arm of men's athletics. And basically, our lawsuit was against the university. It wasn't against men's athletics, but it was the university because they were the ones that set up the structure for how we operated. We were in separate areas at that time. We were not under the Intercollegiate Athletic Administration. Our administration, when Joanne Washburn was our athletic director, went through the College of Education or directly to Wallace Beasley, who was assigned to oversee athletic programs at that time. So it was kind of interesting to learn all about the inner workings of the university. But as coaches, as I mentioned earlier, we just had the opportunity to add on to our teaching loads initially, and then gradually we were given like quarter relief time. And at the end in '82, I was finally half-time to coach women's athletics, but I also taught half-time. And we didn't have regular assistant coaches either. For the most part, it was graduate students that came in to do their master's degree in physical education and were interested in coaching. And so they'd be assigned. So you'd have that graduate student for 1 year. And then the next year you'd have another one, the next year, another one. So there wasn't any continuity in regard to that. Also, what we did, because we didn't have the network, or girls had not had the opportunity to participate in sports and develop the skills they needed, is we ran JV teams as well. So when I was coaching volleyball, we had a JV. In fact, we had 3 volleyball teams, and the third team would play the community colleges in the area, and the JV team would play the smaller colleges, and the main team, the varsity team, would play the major universities. And throughout the Northwest, that it would be like Washington, Oregon State, Idaho, Montana State. And we even competed with the University of British Columbia and sometimes with Simon Fraser as well. You know, we took everybody. But gradually, as things became more structured and we moved under a national organization, the Canadian schools could not be a part of that. We could still play them, but we could not have them as part of the organization. There seemed to be limiting opportunities that way. So, you know, we would still go up and play games at UBC and come down and play at Western Washington, and we'd always make our trip to include more games probably than we would these days with that. But in the meantime, you're trying to keep up with your teaching load. And we were at that point trying to keep up with what we were trying to do with the lawsuit and everything else. And without having assistant coaches, I mean, today's women athletes have a lot more personal attention than we were ever able to give our athletes. Because besides the head coach, how many assistant coaches do you have? And then you have people that handle the training. You have sports psychologists, you have strength trainers, you have various managers that help handle all the stuff for when you travel. So, you know, they take care of making sure the uniforms get where they're supposed to be. It wasn't till close to the end that we even had a trainer that traveled with some of the teams. I learned how to tape ankles and knees in the 70s as well, because we just did it all. So when we went to court, a lot of it was looking at the inequities as they existed, and you know, the court itself was held. We filed under state law, partly because the NCAA was trying to tie up Title IX at the federal level with various ways of saying athletics should not be included as part of Title IX. And so that was going on at the federal level, but Washington State is an equal rights state. We have that in the Constitution. And there was also some precedent, and I can't remember, it was in the Tri-Cities, even earlier than ours. A girl wanted to play, I think it was football. And of course, what people would do is they would just wait out until they went on, they finished, I don't know whether it's high school or whether it was junior high, and moved on. And then they were no longer, being influenced by whatever the decisions were being made. So that court case lots of times would go away, because they say, you don't have a vested interest in the outcome of this case. Well, at the university level, we seem to be able to hang on to people a little longer and also bring them back to explain what the situations were like when they went through. And the lawsuit itself was turned into class action for the athletes, because so many of them could not be contacted individually in order to have them come on as named plaintiffs. Not all women athletes were really supportive of the lawsuit. I don't know whether they felt that at least they were getting more opportunities than they'd ever had, so therefore it was okay. We were trying to make things better for those who came after us. And not so much as far as that we were ever going to be the beneficiaries of the lawsuit, because that we knew just wasn't going to happen. When you sue your employer, there's a lot of negative things that go on out there, and you just try and approach things in the most reasonable way possible, and which is what we did. We still spoke from the standpoint that we had tried to make changes, to suggest changes, to work within the system, and the system just wasn't going to move. And so until we brought the lawsuit, that we just viewed that was going to be the only way it was going to happen. In fact, I can remember at one Board of Regents meetings where several women's organizations, including Women's Studies, Women's Center, Athletics, were making short presentations to the Board of Regents about what could be done to enhance opportunities and the climate for women on campus. And the president at that time, he said, well, I know we're discriminating against women, but there just isn't anything we can do. And immediately I thought, well, I guess we have no other option but to go to court. So that was sort of the driving force that pushed us that direction, is there wasn't going to be any change, or only minimal that just wouldn't answer the questions at all. So we started in court on a very snowy January in 82, and drove many trips, many days to Colfax. I think we're in court. We decided to go just with the judge, not with a jury, because the issues were going to become more complex. And also, Washington State University is in Whitman County. So we were in the state Superior Court. So it was up to Colfax every day, or every day you could. I was still coaching, so I wasn't there every day because we were traveling and competing. But it was a pretty exhausting time during that time frame. And when we finished with that, then we had to wait even for the judge to rule on the lawsuit. And his ruling exempted football. Well, we had talked with the lawyers about what might be various outcomes of the lawsuit anyway. And their feeling was that no matter what the verdict was, that there were going to be appeals requested. And so even though we were fairly exhausted at that time, and some people did not want us to appeal, he said, well, without football being included, we're not going to really be able to have equity, because part of the equity was to have, a proportional number of opportunities for women, proportionate based upon the student body enrollment. And at that time, it was about 40% women, somewhere around that time. So it was always going to have more opportunities for men anyway at that point in time. More slots, if you want to look at it that way. Your sports did not have to be the same. You just had to provide opportunities. And so we pushed for the appeal. Well, we didn't have to, somehow the appeals court decided they weren't going to handle it, and we just went to the Washington State Supreme Court. But we didn't get there until 1985. And some of us went over Celia Banks, Forrest Banks, who was women's senator at that time, was one of them. And Joanne Washburn went, I went. Again, it was people, not exactly the same lawyers, but close affiliates with the Northwest Women's Law Center that argued before the state Supreme Court. So we went over to hear those arguments. It was very enlightening. And then you just have to wait for the verdict. Well, it wasn't until August 6th, 1987. And I pick up the paper. I'm not even in town. I'm up at the condo up in North Idaho. And I go down for the paper, and there it is on the front page. As far as that we won, that the state Supreme Court agreed that football had to be included. We couldn't include a lot of other measures that had to do with, faculty, the coaches' salaries and the other things like that, because we didn't have the money to pull up the full transcript from the trial. That was just going to be more costly than we could afford. And so they were arguing on points of law about the situation at that particular point in time. So from there, even though I was already serving on committees, because at the trial level, we had won. Yes, WSU had discriminated against women athletes. That was the verdict, except football didn't need to be included in the numbers. So now football had to be included. So that meant other things had to happen. Also, at the end of the initial trial, finally, head coaches were full-time. Surprise, surprise. And they had permanent assistant coaches, not as many as today, but there were permanent assistant coaches. So you could start seeing some of the immediate changes taking place. And when I finished that year, I stepped down from coaching. I just knew that they had probably, ruined my reputation, they meaning the university, in a way that athletes were going to go elsewhere. They wouldn't want to be coached by me or other people who were directly involved. All coaches had to sign on. If you didn't sign on, then you were not a member of that lawsuit. But as I said, the athletes got turned into a class action lawsuit. And so as coaches, we met a lot in terms of talking about strategies or just frustrations that had happened to us all during this time period. But I went back into full-time teaching. But I did serve on committees in athletics to help work toward a good transition. Also at that time, the athletic departments, the administration had decided they would be combined. So now we're going to be one athletic department. Well, by doing that, Joanne Washburn got cut out of there. Marcia was able to survive, Marcia Sainholtz, and was able to move over there and did a lot over the years. She was very effective in working within that system and guiding the initial or the additional things that have occurred for women's sports over her time frame in that athletic area. But she was one that was not as directly involved in our lawsuit as some of the rest of us who had been there longer. Marcia hadn't been there that long. And so it was one of those things that the transition occurred. I went back into full-time teaching. Joanne went back into full-time teaching because we were both tenured in the Department of Physical Education for Women. Also at that time, other mergers were occurring on campus. Home economics went with agriculture. Women's physical education and men's physical education had to merge. So there are all these other things going on that were not always the most positive things, but sometimes you don't have much say in administrative structure. You go on and try and do your best to have your input into the decisions that will be made. So there are a lot of things that happen that way. And then part of the problem with, okay, as you start expanding women's programs, how are you going to pay for them? So there was a lot of discussion with state legislators as far as how to approach getting some additional funding at the state level. And at that particular time, I was also working as faculty representative for Washington State University. There were two of us that would regularly be at in Olympia during the legislative sessions. And so I agreed that I would would try and help work on that as well. And so we worked through the Senate, the House and the Senate Higher Education Committees. Particularly Ken Jacobson was in the House Higher Education Committee, and he was very helpful. Of course, he had daughters, and he could see what was happening to them too. So, fathers with daughters became an important part of the whole thing. Eugene Prince, who was our senator from this area, he was a Republican, was very helpful in terms of helping me learn my way around Olympia and who to see and when to see him and how to do all those kinds of things. And so he was very helpful behind the scenes in terms of getting that initial legislation passed, where then the four-year institutions, they had to form plans which passed their Board of Regents for how they were going to use the money. And those plans had to be approved by the Higher Education Coordinating Board at that time. Before the money could be dispersed, but each university could do it their own way. We did not have to agree with how the money would be spent. It just had to be approved by your own Board of Regents and then by the Higher Education Board before that could be distributed. And also along with that, the institutions were required to do a yearly, I think it was yearly, maybe it was every 2 years, study of Title IX on their campus, not just athletics, but let's look at which majors are there. And how come we don't have more women in veterinary medicine? How come we don't have more women in engineering? So you had to address the various majors that were being offered on campus and how you're going to help change that area so it would be more open to both men and women. The College of Agriculture was another one. If home economics hadn't moved over there, women just weren't being hired. And now you look at that college and you see how many women are there and also in the administrative structure. It's just remarkable. And you see women being able to be promoted through the ranks and into positions in the central administration as well as within their various colleges. So I see, a lot of things that have happened, not just in athletics, but, throughout the university. And other things that I have seen as I've watched more things now on television is the increased number of women in communications. I don't see much in the newspaper that's really changed a lot. They still give a lot more press to the men's teams and more photos and all those other things. It's men's teams, men's teams, men's teams. Even the WNBA doesn't get the coverage here that the regular NBA does. And trying to find some of the women's basketball games on television, it's hard to find the ones in the area. You might find the ones from the East Coast, probably because they fit their time slots better, but at least they have more women on camera and doing play-by-plays and other things like that. So you're seeing a gradual move into that area as well, and into the training rooms. And even from the standpoint of women trainers for football teams. So we're gradually seeing more progress being made and openings there. It's still kind of, it's still viewed as being the exception to the rule in many areas. And I think I'll stop there because I don't know that I would have anything else to kind of conclude this with. And I'd rather, answer your questions or hear about what you think that, that you experienced and through this time change through period as well. Because 72 to 82 to 92 were really big transition areas.
Well, Sue, I want to thank you for very comprehensive. Can you hear me? Everybody hear me? Yes. A comprehensive accounting of what had happened. And your comment about parents who have daughters, it just hit me right between the eyes. I have two daughters. And I remember when there were discussions on behalf of the school board about what facilities would be increased because, we have women athletes at the high school and in middle school. And one of the people who was there said, well, it was just fine when I went through it. We don't need any more facilities for girls. And I tell you what, I practically got up on the table. I was so upset just because it was good enough for your generation. That doesn't mean it's good enough for my daughter's generation.
Right.
I want more facilities at home high school. And so I'm glad that Ken Jacobson felt the same way, that he could
Mhm,
see what was
mhm.
wrong. So, Bobby, do we have anybody in the chat? Any questions in the chat?
No, I don't see anybody in the chat, but I do have a question for Sue, for me, and that is, so you mentioned that Sally Savage came on. Did she come on as an attorney on behalf of the university?
Well, she was the AG here at the time.
Oh, okay.
And so she was involved in the lawsuit, but she was not the one that the main lawyer. She was always at the table, but she was not the main lawyer. Fry was. No, not Fry. Oh dear. He was in the lawyer's office down there. Michael, the MISB, Savage and Brown law firm.
Yeah, Erwin Michael by Savage and Brown.
Yes, but
Yeah.
Wally Friel. No, it wasn't Wally Friel.
No.
Was he the son or the dad?
Well,
The son.
Anyway,
I think he was the son.
okay, that was then he was the one. He has since passed away.
Right.
On that, but he's the one that was that we gave depositions to during the discovery phases, and he was the one doing the questioning during the lawsuit for the university that when we were in Colfax. Now, when we went to the Washington State Supreme Court, Sally was the one that presented the university's arguments there.
Oh,
So I have a
interesting.
question at this point, Sue.
Uh-huh.
A huge disparity in uniforms and locker rooms and transportation. I mean, how did the university have a leg to stand on? How was it just tradition? How could they argue that this was fair? I've heard you talk before about that girls bought their own uniforms and
Yes.
you
Mhm.
know, and shared lockers. It was nothing fancy like the men had. So
No.
how did
And
the
there,
university justify that?
and there was no recognition of women as being athletes either from that standpoint. So, you know, in 2007, the university did make amends for that. They held a big function for women athletes that were the prior athletes to probably 1985 or something like that. And they were back, and there was a big program that went on that weekend and included a presentation. They did get awards, but they were more from the standpoint of plaques rather than gear, although you did get a vest at that time and things like that. So they did have a lot more formal recognition through that event that was held at Schweitzer at that time. And so, you know, I have to say the university did, and they did make a real effort to contact everybody to invite them to that event. So a lot of previous athletes, you know, came to that, and we're very pleased that the university finally acknowledged that women athletes were important. But it was definitely a growing period.
Yeah, but what's the answer to my question? How in court could they justify the huge difference in how just the basic essentials that we take for granted that women should have? Did they address that at all?
Well, they would have us, you know, talk about different things. I don't remember exactly all the questions I had. I was on the stand for 2 days. I was pretty tired at the end of that time period. And, you know, at one point I do remember turning to the judge and say, I'm so fatigued. I had to ask him 3 times to repeat the question. And I couldn't even track on it long enough to answer it. And, you know, so it was trying to remember exactly what you had answered to those questions in your deposition, because any little thing that was different, they said, well, now, this is the way you answered it there. So you were constantly trying to keep track there. And they did point out, but the university was busy trying to say why men's sports were different and how important men's sports were to the university. Maybe some of you in other areas have more insight.
We have a question from Mary Collins. What was happening at other universities during this time? Oops, she's muted.
Oh, I'm trying to undo. Give me a minute.
I unmuted me.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so other universities were about in the same boat as far as in the Northwest. Now, some other sections of the country were making more progress. They had been able to start doing more as far as awarding athletic scholarships. Of course, about that time that we were in court in '82, the other unfortunate thing that happened is the NCAA could see that they were not going to be successful in trying to have athletics removed from Title IX. And so they pressured university presidents that really women's athletics should be under the NCAA, because why should you support two national organizations? And so what happened is the presidents supported the NCAA, not the AIW. We could see that happening because the AIW ran more on a shoestring, and those that have money have power, so it's called follow the money. And they, including our university, would no longer pay the dues to the AIAW. So that organization folded. And then all women's sports went under NCAA. And then that transition happened. It wasn't sort of the Pac-10 or the Pac-12 as we see it now. Even some of the men's minor sports competed in the northern part of the Pac-10. And then there was a southern part of the Pac-10, what they called NORPAC or SPAC. And a lot of that was due to travel costs. But the university had to figure out ways to enhance funding and other things like that for the university to be able to do it. Then there was money from the legislature coming in as well that helped support that. And that was finally finalized. There was a sunset law there, but it was finally finalized as a permanent thing at the legislature.
Thank you. We have a question from Jane.
Sure.
Am I saying your name right, Jane? Your last name?
Yeah, perfect.
She has some comments, and I remember when I was still on campus, you were a coach. I don't know if you're still there coaching, but
I still am.
anyway,
20
still
years.
am. Okay, 20 years. Okay, so go ahead,
Yeah.
please.
Well, I just specific to what was happening, like I think what a lot of people don't realize, like I'm boots on the ground. I started coaching at Oregon State University 94, 95. And Marcia Sainholtz actually recruited me to come, and I started in 2002. And when I arrived here, to be perfectly frank, I was determined to hate it because I had created this nice life for myself at Oregon State. And when I showed up, I was like shocked by the budget. I was shocked by the fact that the men and women each received about the same amount of Russell athletic gear. I was shocked by, I was actually shocked by the equity because it was not, and still not, the same at Oregon State. So Sue and all of the women that, you obviously changed the world, but you specifically changed Washington State to be a leader. And along with, I kind of, Marcia showed, because when I showed up here, we were in the midst of 3 10-win football seasons, and it was very clear that you could have a successful football program and you could treat everybody else fairly. And that is what people across the world still today think is the problem is, well, we don't have enough money for everybody to be successful, but you actually do if you just implement it and make it work and hire the right people. And so even my colleagues around the Pac-12 are not, they don't have as the same, and of course, we're in a situation where things could always be better and we work towards that. But relative to our peer institutions in the Pac-12, I would hazard a guess it's best here.
Wow.
It's really amazing that what you guys and the legacy you've left, and it's unfortunate that there weren't the same powerful women to lead the charge in Oregon and to lead the charge at, in the Bay Area and to lead the charge in Los Angeles, because they still are fighting things that are put to bed here.
Well, I think the other thing that we did is we maintained our vigilance. And if they tried to do things, like there was one point where they're going to drop volleyball, we said the coach needs to be fired, the volleyball team needs to stay. And if you try and do anything, we're going to be right there backing the volleyball team again. And, when we merged departments, we did lose some sports. We lost women's gymnastics. We lost women's field hockey. We lost ski team. And other sports were added in. And it was, during that time period, we finally were able to get soccer added in, and then rowing. And before that, rowing was kind of functioning as a club sport, as well as that's the case with the men, I think, still today, that they're more a club sport than under the administrative structure of intercollegiate athletics, but I could be wrong on that.
Oh, you're correct.
Okay, but there are definitely changes that happened that we didn't have control over. So we tried to do things as best we could. Marcia, because now she was in the now merged athletic department, push soccer and push rowing. Part of it was because more people could be involved in the numbers, and that would be advantageous for football because football had so many people. Also, it helped in terms of how many scholarships needed to be given. And so there are other things that were counted in. And again, it wasn't equal. You had to have equitable opportunity. In other words, your uniform didn't have to cost as much as a football player's uniforms. Obviously, there's going to be differences among uniforms because of the things that are involved there. But if they have game uniforms and practice uniforms and sweats and all that, then so should the other teams. So it's from the standpoint of having equitable opportunity, even though the dollar signs might not be equal. But we still remain vigilant. Even today, those of us are still hanging around here to try and make sure we hope things are moving in the right direction, although we're further removed.
Okay,
I
we got a-
appreciate your comments, Jane.
Yeah, so Noelle Nicolai has something she'd like to ask. Go ahead, Noelle. Bobby, can you unmute her, please?
She can
Okay.
Unmute, Noel.
I'm curious, Sue,
Uh-huh.
about your, I'd like you to comment on how you think the NCAA permitting pay for play will impact women in sport.
Well, that's an interesting question. I've asked that from the standpoint of all sports because we know obviously that there are some sports where they have individuals that already get more recognition. I mean, the newspapers just pick it up that way. I think it'll take a while for things to filter beyond the men's basketball and football teams. And maybe women's basketball will fit in there somewhere because of the WNBA push. It's hard to know. Golf maybe, and tennis. I'm not as familiar, with some of the other outlets that might be influenced by that rule change, other than I know we've had women golfers go on to the pros. And I don't know where we are at this point. We have had some basketball players, but then that part of the WNBA folded at times, and then it came back under different versions and seems to be doing quite well at the present time. And so I think as those individuals get more recognition, then the colleges will get more, particularly if they were on TV more. So you got to identify what these are the players. When you only see a team once or twice, you don't really have any connection with the players. So I think, let's see where we are in 5 years.
One interesting thing just to add about that is Charlize Ledger-Walker, obviously
Yes.
a very marketable person. At this point, international student athletes are not allowed to be a part of the same thing. So that's a real drawback.
No, thank you for that information.
And also, I just wanted to, again, thank you for opening doors, because I was a baby basically in the 70s. And you opened the doors so I could go to college. And thank you.
I'm happy to do so. Yeah, it's interesting to know the percentages have changed so much in terms of they should be offering more opportunities for women to be athletes, because there are more women than men on college campuses these days.
Right.
And, so you see through some of those kinds of things as well.
So we got one more comment. Should the NCAA have been fined or had repercussions for the inequality shown last year in the playoffs? You have a comment on that?
I was so proud of the athletes just pointing all out that was there. Of course, Tara Vanderveer, which I've known for years because she started coaching when I was coaching. And to see her do well and for her to make comments about it. I mean, talk about something that just showed the inequities that exist, and that the NCAA is still in the backwoods when it really comes to addressing equity and not seeing, what they've done. I don't know how to address that. It was just truly enlightening to a lot of folks.
Well, but I think we only have a couple more minutes. Is there, if anybody else has a quick question, or should we thank our presenter and let her be on her way?
I think we have a question from Sue. Yes.
So,
Okay, Sue.
You're going to have to unmute yourself, Sue.
Sorry, thank you. Sue, how did your work in Washington come out the same, or at what point was Washington involved with the entire United States thoughts on Title IX? I'm not sure we got as much exposure as the eastern states and so on. Were we a bit behind, or were we too far ahead?
Well, no, at that particular time, the Northeast was fairly well structured under the AIW, as was the California region. And so there are developing regions. And of course, there's a bigger population base back there. And so the initial basketball tournament, national basketball tournament, which I took our team to, was only a 16-team tournament. You had to qualify through your regions, but we only got one slot. Some regions that had so many universities got 2 slots. And so, it was really a Sweet 16 experience at that particular time in that very first tournament that was held in Illinois at that time period. But then, as they moved into the NCAA structure, they've gradually been able to move the size of that tournament and in all sports to a greater number of individuals involved. But the other thing is I know other colleges in this state were not anxious to repeat. They didn't want to go to court. I talked with different people, and gave them some suggestions about how they might improve the situation on their campus. At the present time, because our lawsuit is out there in public domain, the lawyers know, and they know, how to use that lawsuit to help them in any cases that have come since. And there have been some, and even those, including coaches now, because they're covered, that have to do with salary inequities. And I mean, we couldn't even approach that because we couldn't argue that on the appeal because we couldn't afford to pull up the initial court trial.
Okay, well,
Great.
I want to echo Karen Barron's comment here in the chat, thanking you, Sue, for all that you've done for women athletes and for our university. It's a remarkable legacy. I hope you're very proud of all that you've accomplished. So thank you for being with us today.
I have to thank a lot of my colleagues because believe me, one person can't do this at all. I mean, there were other coaches involved, and as new coaches came on, they signed on. It took all of us to be able to do that. The same thing with the athletes.
I'm sure it did. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Libby, I think we should
Yes.
also read Carolyn Joshua Jones' comment, which is so informative. Love learning about the surrounding culture of the time. So curious about the fish fans. I've never heard of them.
Oh my. Oh dear.
Yeah.
Apparently they were a big deal.
They
Yeah.
were. We put on 2 or 3 shows on that weekend and sold them all out back in Smith Pool and then in the Gibb Pool area during that time frame. And
That was synchronized swimming kind of.
synchronized swimming, yes. Mhm. And
Very
we had men involved too. So,
Wow,
we were inclusive at that time.
that's great. Well, thank you so much, Sue. This has been just a wonderful session. It is, as I said, recorded. And so if anybody wants to miss some details, you can go back and check on that. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I was happy to sort of give my reflections, even though a lot of them were sort of a little out of order. It was nice to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you.